Okay, so what I put in chat was a link to an article that I just saw today by two elder statesmen, John Kasich and Leon Panetta, and they're calling for a commission, some sort of bipartisan commission to deal with the deficit. They're very unspecific. They don't say whether it should consist of elected officials or not. They don't say whether it should have any particular powers, but they are very clear that it should deal with the big issues in the deficit, things like Social Security and Medicare. And you don't have to react right away, Phil, but um, consider how this fits in with your book. Does it illustrate that Congress is dysfunctional because somebody's saying we need this weird commission? Does it illustrate two people who remember when Congress was more functional and are trying to relive those days? Does it represent politics at its best? Does it represent the best solution that you could come up with for dealing with the deficit, and so on? So anyway, something to kind of let the back of your mind think about. Well, maybe we try to get a little more background on the book. So, in your view, and this, try to do this briefly, what is Congress for?
Sure. So America is a big, diverse country, and we need a representative body to represent the complexity, the manyness of the country, and to allow the different factions to come into contact with each other, to bump up against each other, to figure out accommodations with each other. Congress, at its best, allows that process to unfold in a way that all the participants find legitimate. They buy into the fact that the process is more or less fair, that they are going to be given their chances in this long iterative game of politics that never comes to an end, and they live with the results of it. That, to my mind, is a vastly superior model of governing than trying to run everything through the executive branch and have everything switch whenever we change control of the White House. Not only because it produces greater policy durability and stability, but because if you try to just hang everything on those quadrennial elections, they really sort of become these apocalyptic struggles where everyone feels like the whole world is at stake, and the other side are mortal enemies. And I think it puts our politics into a very terrible frame of mind, a negative sum frame of mind, when we reduce everything to these struggles over control of the White House. Congress, when it's working well, creates a sense of possibility, a sense that different factions may have quite fundamental divergences in what they believe about the world, but they can nevertheless find ways of working together when it comes to solving concrete problems that face the country. So that's what we need from Congress. We don't always get it today, and that's sort of the argument of my book is why we're already suffering, and if we don't take some corrective action, are likely to suffer quite a lot more if Congress continues to recede from the picture of sort of the serious policymaking.
So let's just go through some history. Start from, let's say, the very founding of the country. Was there a consensus about how the relative strength of the branches of government was likely to play out? My amateur impression is that if there was a consensus, it was that Congress was going to be the strongest body. Is that a fair assessment?
Madison in the Federalist Papers talks about Congress being this impetuous vortex that sucks everything into it, and certainly that was their worry in some ways, that the legislature would be too strong. And of course, creating the Constitution was in part an attempt to create a stronger executive branch capable of holding its own. So I think the framers of the Constitution really did hope for some sense of dynamic balance. I think the old line from Madison about ambition counteracting ambition is really meant to do a lot of work to keep the country from going down one of many different paths to tyranny. And they believed in the virtue of diversity of factions as a way of keeping Congress from becoming just a creature of sort of majority party steamrolling. Of course, they didn't count on strong political parties when they were framing the Constitution, but that was their general sense, that Congress would be the leading institution, coming up with, and Article 1 of the Constitution really gives Congress the power to make things happen that it doesn't give to the other branches.
And there was also an expectation back then that the House of Representatives would settle most presidential elections. They didn't expect that the Electoral College would actually yield a majority. Okay, so if we go through the 19th century, how did Congress evolve maybe differently than people expected, and what were its kind of strengths and weaknesses in those days?
Well, I think, first of all, it's worth just saying that in the first half of the 19th century, some of the sort of giant figures of American politics were members of Congress, even sort of held in preeminence above most of the presidents of that time. So Henry Clay and Daniel Webster and John Calhoun, especially, that triumvirate was really thought of as sort of the leading men of American politics. And of course, they didn't agree on many things, but they found ways of working together and adjudicating all the sectional differences that made American politics hard in the first half of the 19th century. That worked until it didn't. I think all of America's political institutions failed around the mid-19th century, leading to the Civil War. Congress after the Civil War, Congress during the Civil War is kind of an exciting place. I'm reading a book right now about what went on there after the Southern representatives disappeared from the scene. They enacted quite an ambitious domestic policy agenda. But Congress after the war becomes, I'd say it's fair to say, a pretty corrupt place, a place that's about party struggle and the contest for spoils. One of the things I talk about in the book is what sort of place Congress was when a young Woodrow Wilson confronted it and wrote his famous book, Congressional Government, in the early 1880s. And yeah, it was a place that was sort of engaged in a mad scramble for spoils. People felt that neither party was really about much. Republicans and Democrats were sort of running on the fumes of the Civil War as much as anything else. And so Congress is a fairly rudderless place, let's say, in the 1870s and 1880s. And people are frustrated with it. And so it makes a big push to become a place with much stronger leadership. Wilson looks across the pond to Prime Minister Gladstone in England and says, why don't we try to make Congress a place that operates more like the British Parliament? That's a common sentiment. But in any case, what happens is that Congress develops very strong congressional leaders. And so you have Czar Reed, as they called him, Speaker Reed, and in the first decade of the 20th century, Boss Cannon, Joseph Gurney Cannon. And those two were thought of as some of the most dominant party politicians in the history of the country. So part of the argument in my book is you see these broad shifts from Congress being a sort of more chaotic, disorganized place to becoming a place with strong leaders, and in time, sort of a sense that the leaders are in fact stifling. They're sort of running everything out of their hip pocket and making it hard for anyone to debate things in a very interesting way anymore. And their sort of party orthodoxy becomes stale, and eventually we get a seminal moment in the history of the House of Representatives, which is the overthrow of Joseph Gurney Cannon in 1910, when a group of progressive Republicans join up with Democrats to remove him as the head of the Rules Committee and ultimately decentralize power to some degree in the House. And getting into the 20th century, for much of that period after 1910, you see seniority of committee chairmen become a sacrosanct principle, such that each chairman becomes his own independent power center, really answering to nobody. The Speaker of the House sort of acts as a coordinator in that era rather than a general giving orders.
And does that last up through, let's say, the 1970s, would you say?
Through around 1960, the directionality starts to reverse around 1960, I'd say. But yeah, we get yeah, go ahead.
I still remember Wilbur Mills being this powerful committee chairman up until around 1973 or 74 when he
well,
wound up in the tidal basin.
Yes,
not a good thing for him.
With his stripper with the black eye in his car.
Yeah.
So Wilbur Mills is one of these Southern giants of Congress, right? The committee chairmen were, in fact, disproportionately Southern conservatives because, of course, they basically came from one-party political systems and not one-party systems that had very vigorous primary competition. So they pretty much held their seat as long as they wanted it, and that meant that they became the most senior members and chaired a lot of the most important committees in both the House and the Senate.
So was that period from, let's say, 1910, and I'll extend it out to 1970? Was that a golden age for Congress in your view, or?
I think every configuration has its own problems, but to me, in 2023, it feels a lot like a golden age because when I look at the institution we have today, it's such a boring top-down affair. And when I look back at this institution as it was in say the 1950s, it was a much more complicated place with more interesting fluid coalition building going on, less of a sense that less of a sense of clear divisions that always held for everything, more of a sense of having to accommodate your colleagues on an ongoing basis and taking comity very seriously indeed. And so I think that institution was better able to get us through some very hard problems in a way the country accepted as legitimate than the institution we have today. So to that extent, I look back at it as having some golden age tendencies, even though I recognize that from some other angles, there were certainly some serious problems.
And how much of that is sort of the change from then to now internal to Congress or external to it? So I'll take something like, the civil rights legislation, where, Northern Republicans were, were a key constituent to getting civil rights legislation passed. You could, if they had decided to block it, it would have been blocked. And I think there was the sense, and that lasted really through the Reagan administration and maybe beyond, that important legislation ought to be bipartisan. You know, that, and Reagan didn't have a Republican majority in Congress most of the time, and yet he got his bills passed. And I think it's only, in this century, or possibly before, but I think only in this century, this notion that you could have something like Obamacare be passed on essentially a party line vote. But is it internally the Congress that somehow their rules and methods have changed, or are the external conditions under which they're operating, which accounts for the difference?
Yeah, I'd go with and both. Um, I think the internal stuff is severely underrated in the discourse. I think people generally want to say that the story is, well, we used to be a complicated coalition system where the Democratic Party was this weird historical holdover and had conservatives and liberals in it, and Republicans also had conservatives and liberals in it, and that was more complicated. And then we gradually have gotten to our clean mono-dimensional polarization, and Congress has gone along with that. And I think there's definitely some amount of truth to the external account that something has changed about the extent to which American politics is nationalized and polarized at the level of the electorate. But I tend to think that the Congress is actually accelerating that process because of the decisions that are being made about its internal organization, and because of the way that so many of its leading members embrace an idea of politics as drawing sharp distinctions between the two parties and sending it to the electorate to decide, rather than a more coalition building kind of system. I think, Arnold, when looking at the premise of your question, I think a lot of important legislation today is still bipartisan, and we shouldn't lose track of that. I mean, if you just look at the 117th Congress, the first 2 years of the Biden administration, right, we got a lot of important bills that basically came from sort of centrist gangs in the Senate getting together and putting together deals that could get 70 votes in the Senate. And so that still is a recipe for doing important lawmaking, even today in a Congress that has some trouble doing important lawmaking, but it's still there. It hasn't gone extinct. I think your sense is right that there have been some heavier reliance on this passing things through budget reconciliation in a strictly partisan manner, right, where we try to figure out just what we can jam through with 50+1 votes in the Senate. And certainly the first 2 years of the Obama administration were pretty notable for just how much important partisan lawmaking went on there. It's sort of a very commanding performance by Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid and Speaker Nancy Pelosi to sort of get all their troops in line such that they could legislate largely without any help from Republicans during that time.
And so what are some of the internal factors that
so this seniority of committee chairman is a big one. Just are the committee chairmen more or less guaranteed to keep their jobs, or do they pretty much get appointed by the speaker? That one should not be underestimated. That's a huge difference, and it doesn't even require the speaker to be constantly throwing people overboard if they all know that he has that power or she has that power. There's really a pretty dramatic shift toward thinking that committee chairs sort of take part of what speakers wants the agenda to be and march with it rather than driving the agenda independently. And I think there's a lot of shift in terms of how deliberation functions in both chambers as well. The shift from more chances for members to offer amendments, both in committee and on the floor of their respective chambers, to having up or down votes on alternatives that are sort of pre-framed with the, often sort of at the behest of the leadership again. So those kinds of manipulating the agenda in the Senate, there's all sorts of devices that the majority leader now uses to sort of shut off debate. It's called filling the amendment tree is a big one. So there's all kinds of shifts, some of which are embodied in the formal rules that the chambers adopt, many of which are sort of embodied in the cultural folkways of what members expect to happen.
What about,
both have shifted.
let me throw another random question that's related, is kind of the smoke-filled room versus the fishbowl. Sort of the smoke-filled room was where, people of different political parties could get together, reach a compromise, and then drive it through the rest of the Congress. And the public might not have been aware of that. I mean, if let's say an immigration law compromise had been forged in the 1980s, they could have passed it probably without getting, a huge hue and cry from partisans on either side. But now they're in a fishbowl, and anyone who proposes a compromise, that set themselves up to be, berated and primaried by people within their own party. So what would be your comment on that? And I think that also selects for a different type of person. I think some of the, more obnoxious members of Congress get there because they take advantage of the kind of fishbowl world. They would not be considered big, like, AOC or Marjorie Greene in a smoke-filled room world would be non-entities. In a fishbowl world, they're important. And in some ways, Congress is now selecting for that. So anyway, any reactions to that?
Yeah, I think there's no question that something has shifted, and the sense of activist groups having more chances to berate people for any transgressions from their preferred line. I think there's a correct sense that has shifted. I mean, part of it is that Congress used to do, the House of Representatives used to take a lot more unrecorded votes. And the shift toward being able to hold everyone accountable for every vote. I mean, that's partially a technological change story, that electronic voting makes it so much easier. But I think that the electoral environment today definitely disciplines members to act in this system where everyone hews to the party line, and there's not a lot of possibility for compromise. I think it's a change in the media environment as well, right? We have the fishbowl, but it's a national fishbowl. I think you get very different coverage. Basically, a lot of us would have read about Congress through the lens of our local newspaper a generation ago, and those people had their own core of reporters who largely followed the state's own delegation around and sort of understood things largely through their eyes. That creates a very different sense of what's going on, and how constituents relate to their representatives than what we have today. I think that's a real loss that so few people do that anymore, just because the option isn't there.
So let me just jump ahead. I want to save some time to get our audience involved. So what are your favored solutions when we get to that, to sort of
Yeah,
make Congress work as well as it could?
yeah. So I think I'm not trying to write a book where I have three great ideas that if only somebody would hear about them, we could fix the place. I sort of purposely eschewed writing a chapter like that goes at the end of the book. And um, I, I'm hoping that given my sense of Congress as a place that has undergone some big vicissitudes in the past, that has changed and that has seen eras of top-down leadership dominance before and gotten through them and past them. My hope is that the pendulum is about to swing back that way again. And my book is trying to sort of give a sense of what that could look like and why it would be a good thing for the country. So I would very much like to see more decentralization in the chambers. I would like to see power flow to the committee chairman. I would like to see there be more opportunities for meaningful deliberation and debate than we currently have on the chamber floors in either place. But really, the key is to get a sense of interesting factional interplay going, right? A sense that it's not just about R's and D's lining up to vote against each other. That really, when we confront a big problem, we're allowing the different diverse factions of the country to come together and work something out in ways that surprise us all. I think Congress, when it's working well, when it's the kind of place that we can really respect, it ought to be a really interesting and surprising place. There ought to be a sense that something is coming out of the process at the end that wasn't there at the beginning. Actually, the encounters between these members who come together, who congress, and they come up with something new. It's a sort of, I'm attracted to metaphors of fertility for what Congress is doing when it's working well. So we need to get away from a sense that Congress is just a staging ground for arguments that have already been had elsewhere. And we need to get away from a sense that Congress is just a big pain in the butt and we should feel lucky if we can just get it out of the picture entirely.
Yeah, I like your point of sort of having, surprise or something new come out, because I think, when the civil rights, in this sort of golden era, as it were, like when civil rights legislation was debated, it wasn't clear what the outcome was going to be. Now, a lot of legislation, it just seems preordained. It just seems like, they're sort of acting out a charade. I think of something like the Watergate hearings. No one really knew how that was going to come out. I mean, ex post, we can say, well, this happened and this happened
Right.
because of this. But it was really over the course of those hearings that the dynamics emerged and changed. It was not by no means a foregone conclusion.
Right. And you had Sam Ervin, the Southern conservative from North Carolina, who became a hero of the New York Times by the end of it. There were a lot of, the place was very lively a half century ago. There's no question about it.
Yeah. Whether that can happen again, I mean, it certainly looks very different from what we see now, and so it's maybe hard to imagine the
Yeah, I think we feel pretty stuck in the sort of equilibrium we're in, but I think part of it is it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and people just don't even have the imagination to know that things can be a different way. You can have a pretty long political memory at this point, and and still be sort of stuck in this bad equilibrium. So part of my purpose is just to try to get the idea out there that this institution can be a very different sort of place when its members demand that it act a different way.
All right, so let me invite everyone else, just, either physically raise your hand or metaphorically raise your hand when you want to ask a question or make a counterpoint here. I feel like I've been pushing this all in one direction. Okay, so Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, I read some reviews of your book, which is just recently coming out. So there's not so many of them. Like Arnold hasn't written his review yet. I don't think. I haven't seen it
No.
anyway. Uh, um, but my own view is that the biggest problem is not Congress, but it's the administrative state and Congress abdicating its power because, sort of as you're talking about, everybody is showboating for their tribe to the votes. And like Arnold mentioned, it's preordained. If you're Republican, you vote the way the Republicans vote, and if you're Democrat, you vote the way the Democrats vote. Otherwise, you're going to be primaried and get out. But Vivek Ramaswamy has the proposal of 8-year term limits for bureaucrats. And from my point of view, getting term limits on the administrative state would be among the Overton window of things that I've heard. I think that would be the best possible change that we can make.
The thing is about your discussion there, Tom, is that you said Congress abdicated all this power and allowed it to flow into the administrative state. And I mean, it's even actually more decisive than that. Congress intentionally gave this power away to the administrative state. And so figuring out how you can force Congress to take responsibility for things itself is a bit of a puzzle, because there does seem to be this legislative tendency now, far from being an impetuous vortex, actually being the opposite, something that wants to push real power out into the other branches and then complain about it and raise money off of complaining about it. So I think I'm sympathetic to ideas like the REINS Act that have gotten play over the last decade, that would force important rulemakings to come before Congress to get an up or down vote if they're going to take effect or not. I think, unfortunately, they've been proposed in a pretty purely partisan manner that never really had much of a chance of working out. And we need to think about ways of packaging that idea, which is a constitutionally attractive idea rather than a partisan idea, as we need to think of ways of framing that as sort of a constitutional reform rather than a Republican partisan priority. I think there's some hope. I like to talk about the legislative veto that used to exist until the Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional. I think there are some ways that we can structure things such that Congress gets a crack at it before it becomes effective policy, or that it automatically sunsets if Congress doesn't take action. I think that kind of stuff is more promising than it. Like I share the sense that like it's tempting to just sort of take whacks at the administrative state, and I certainly think that there's a lot of excitement on the right these days about these sort of Schedule F possibilities that allow the president to fire people en masse. I think, if there's a second Trump administration or DeSantis administration, you're going to hear an awful lot about those things. But at the end of the day, you do have to figure out a way for Congress to take the responsibility onto itself on an ongoing basis. And so part of it is making the burden seem not too great. I think part of the problem with the REINS Act was it just asked too many votes from Congress. So my line is, we need Congress to take on the big decision. We really don't want Congress involved in the work of administration. And interestingly, Republicans in the 1980s were very big into criticizing the micromanaging tendencies of Congress, because they felt like the Democratic House especially was trying to interject itself into all these Reagan administration prerogatives of administration. So I think there is a healthy sphere for administration, but we need Congress to be the one setting the direction on the big question.
Do today's congressmen care about institutional power anymore? I mean, I think if you went back 40 years or so, senators would have said, the Senate has to have a certain amount of power. We don't want power to be taken away from us. And congressmen would have said the same thing. Is that first of all, do you think that's a fair characterization of the way it was 40, 50 years ago? And is it fair to say that no one cares about that now? Like you couldn't walk into a congressman's office and say, the administration is, doing things without congressional permission. If this keeps up, Congress won't mean anything anymore. Let's, band together and do something as an institution. And I don't think that would sell today. Is that too extreme?
No, I don't think it's completely dead on the Hill today, but I think it is seriously weakened from where it was in the past. And we don't have any sort of, if you try to think of who is a great institutional champion these days, it's not so easy to come up with it. Old Senator Grassley might be the best candidate at this point. Spending a long time in Congress does tend to make people think about its institutional interests to some degree. And I think Grassley has acquired some of those sensibilities over the years. But their last really great institutionalist was Senator Robert Byrd from West Virginia, right? And he's dead more than a decade now. I think that, when you think about like Nancy Pelosi, as she stepped down from being the Democratic leader, left to, all these encomia of what a historically great leader she was. But it was fascinating because almost everyone really views her as having been a successful partisan leader. And if you look at her record as sort of a defender of the institution of Congress, it's not very distinguished at all. I think in many cases, Nancy Pelosi's instinct was, let me punt things over to the White House when I think that's the best move for Democrats. Or just let me bury an issue when that's the most convenient thing. And I do think there are, I think ambition counteracting ambition is a real engine that creates some sense of institutional interest. Like, I just think there's an awful lot of talented, smart people who are members of Congress who really don't like their jobs very much, because what they're asked to do is dial for dollars and show up and vote the way the leaders tell them to. It's not a good job. And they wish for something more. And so naturally, those people start to think about, like, how could Congress be a more interesting place for me? Or maybe they just start thinking about, how can I find the exit? That certainly happens a fair amount also. But so I don't think it's totally moribund. When I and other people broadcasting this message go to the Hill looking for takers, we don't come up completely empty, but it is a sort of countercultural way of thinking. I won't deny that.
All right, we've had a couple hands up. Elijah, you have a.
I'm curious what you think about 10% less democracy and where your views align with or diverge from Garrett Jones. So, I mean, for instance, Tom mentioned term lengths, and I think one of the single biggest proposals that Garrett puts forward is changing the term length of representatives in the House to 6 years and making it staggered instead of electing them all at once, and basically just insulating them from too much of the the populist kind of noise. What are your thoughts?
I didn't know he proposed that. I guess I find a certain attractiveness to the idea that we have different kinds of majorities that have to come together in our bicameral Congress as it exists today. That you have the members of the House elected every cycle, and the senators who follow the 6-year staggered term, and that they have to ultimately come to accommodations across the two chambers to make things work out. Yeah, I would like to find ways to make members less concerned about re-election. I don't tend to think that a lot of the sort of less democracy ideas have very good prospects in our current environment. I just think there's some number of people who sympathize with that, but it's a pretty minority view, and mostly the dominant sensibility is we want more accountability, more chances for voters to have their say, more little d democracy. So I'm sympathetic to Garrett Jones's message, but I don't know that I think framing a reform program in those terms is all that fruitful. I do think there's some amount of enthusiasm right now for electoral mechanism reform, and that seems very healthy, right? The sort of Alaska is using this final five voting method that starts with a nonpartisan primary. I think that probably produces healthier incentives for the elected officials, and since that has some momentum, I'm glad to be a proponent of trying that out some more. It seems to be going pretty well to my eyes. Yeah, if I could wave a wand and make congressional primaries go away, I'd do it in a second. But I just don't think that's where the American people
are. John A.
I'm going to yield to Josh because I often speak at these events. If no one wants to talk later, I'll get on again.
Okay, all right, Josh, go ahead.
Oh, thanks, John. I'll be quick. I was just curious what you think about more radical proposals like expanding the House. If you think that's a recipe for chaos or more dynamism.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me that I get asked that at almost every event that I'm involved in. So I guess it is in the water somewhere that's something we're thinking about these days. Madison in Federalist 57 has a good line that you want there to be more members such that you can have better representativeness of a constituency, but you only want more members up to a certain point, and past that point, your legislative chamber starts resembling a mob and starts falling to the dynamics of mobs. And so I don't know exactly where that number is. I hear that Patrick Deneen's new book proposes making the House of Representatives have 6,000 members. And I'm very confident that that is on very far to one side of that dividing line. And I would think that making the House have 6,000. So I have some scenarios at the end of my book. One of them is called rubber stamp. And somebody in that scenario has the clever idea of making the House have 1,776 members. And that's sort of consistent with what I think of as sort of the end of the House as a meaningful place. When you get to that point, it sort of necessarily becomes like a rubber stamp. The Chinese, people don't know much about the legislature in China. The Chinese People's Congress has like 3,500 members, and I bet you can all guess like what is the quality of deliberation that goes on there, or how much interesting factional interplay there is, right?
How much surprise.
Yeah, so to my mind, like keeping numbers somewhat more manageable such that personal relations can actually play an important role in having these legislators figure things out is very important. You know, modest expansions to the House might not be so bad. They might give it a shot in the arm. So I'm not sort of against every proposal along these lines, but I am sort of a little bit suspicious of the impulse.
Right, Frank, you have something, you have to unmute if you want to.
Do I have the floor?
Yes,
Okay, thank you. Thanks for coming by and explaining the nuances of your new book. Two things strike me. I was skimming a paper by Michael Porter a few years ago, and he suggested to get Congress back moving was to not vilify earmarks, but to, really make them a key part of the bargaining process, and that, earmarks are not that bad because they move things along. They lubricate what Congress, seems to be a very, very friction-based institution. I was wondering what your thoughts on that, but I also would like you to address an observation that I've made, and you reminded me of it early on in this talk, is that in the old days, there were more sectional interest, agriculture, manufacturing, what have you. And I'm thinking about my own Senator Warren, who inveighs against pharmaceuticals, finance, and probably military spending, and they comprise a significant part of the Massachusetts economy. Now, it would be refreshing in a way to see her advocate for those industries, but I think the Congress has become so ideological that it's incapable of going back to furthering sectoral interests. So in Maine it would be potatoes, and Massachusetts it would be finance, and so on and so forth. But I'm wondering what your thoughts are on those 2 points.
Can I ask you, are you any relation to Silvio Conti?
No, unfortunately not. No.
He was a good member of the old school.
Yeah, I mean, he got a hockey rink at BC named after him.
So I think you have to remember that Elizabeth Warren is like at the far end of the spectrum of like how much members are sort of playing for a national constituency versus how much they might sort of keep themselves anchored in the concerns of their local constituents. Elizabeth Warren's senatorial career is like the extension of her frustrated presidential campaign, and probably always will be. And that's a good reason to elect somebody else.
But she's not the only one. I think you could.
No, she's not the only one. But I do feel like there is a show horses versus work horses problem. That's always been a dynamic in Congress. That's nothing new, but it's pretty acute today. And the people who are really good at getting media attention and social media virality are show horses in the extreme. And I do think that there are a lot of workhorses up there on the Hill, many of whom you may never have heard of. And we ought to not forget about them. We ought to sort of be working to make them more important at the expense of the show horses, to the extent we can. Part of that's why committees are so important to me, because that's really where the workhorses need to have the opportunities to let their industriousness sort of put them at a natural advantage. But if everyone just takes what the committee's doing, ignore it, then they don't have much of a chance. I've forgotten the first part of your question.
The first part dealt with earmarks. They shouldn't
Earmarks,
be
yeah.
qualified by, and they might be a mechanism for what you're trying to achieve. Some
Yeah,
kind of cooperation.
I think it seems right to me that earmarks are a way to encourage log rolling. Log rolling means the building of coalitions out of people who might not agree on everything on the top line. It's a way of cutting side bargains.
Yeah.
I think the natural libertarian position is that this is a great recipe for waste. And I don't doubt that there's a good bit of that, but I think that the executive branch, if given lots of discretion over what to do with funding, also finds lots of recipes for waste. And so
Yeah, sure.
in large part, this is a question about whether Congress can use this resource as a way of lubricating its own process, or whether that capacity ought to be sent to the executive branch, where no doubt the president will use it for his own political purposes. And to me, that's an easy call. I just prefer Congress have the power.
If
So
if you could use earmarks to get Congress to vote to raise the retirement age by 6 months, you would save more than any earmarks would cost.
yeah,
John,
lot
hey,
of-
what can we get
Go ahead, yeah.
John, your question?
Well, you teed it up for me. Because I don't think you're going to get anyone in Congress to propose an earmark to raise the retirement age by 6 months. So my question for Dr. Wallach is, you seem, well, you have an aesthetic vision of Congress, which should be a lively place where interesting things happen. I lean libertarian, and my fear is that the more Congress does, the more trouble it makes. I'm overstating, of course. There are
it's a view I'm very well familiar with.
There are big issues that need and deserve attention, but is there really any good reason to think if Congress gets livelier and more active, that the ratio of bad to good is going to change?
I think
a little bit of good and a bunch more bad. So just
Yeah.
one last thing. So, for a person who would like to see more decentralized government, who thinks that Congress should handle just a few things and do them right, and that states and localities should have someone who fears Wagner's law, that as time goes by, the size of government always increases more than the size of the economy. Well, you know all of this. What would you, put it another way, what would you say to Brian Kaplan and Gordon Tullock?
I think this libertarian suspicion of Congress would have made an awful lot of sense through the 1960s. And I think it doesn't make much sense at all in the world we live in today, because there's such a huge reservoir of statutory powers that have been built up over the last half century, that if you think that congressional inaction is a recipe for government passivity, I'm watching a different show than you are. Because to me, when Congress recedes, the vacuum is very quickly filled by the executive branch, and they find statutory justifications for pretty much whatever they want to do. So you may think student loan forgiveness is not so great. I don't think much of it myself, but Joe Biden, and maybe it'll get cut down in the court. Some of these things that the executive branch does will get cut down in the courts in the end. But the way that we did it was the president just decided to add $500 billion to the deficit all on his own, using some cockamamie statutory justification. And that's going to be more and more the wave of the future if we get more and more congressional inaction. So to me, it's a recipe for more arbitrary government if we cut Congress out. I understand that Congress does not look like an optimal policymaker from the point of view of an economist. And so I sort of get the Brian Kaplan, or even the even more extreme version of it, Jason Brennan. Like I get it. Like, these people don't seem like they should make good policy. If they burn themselves out in futility, that must be a win for the rest of us. But I just don't think it's realistic. I think it's a recipe for arbitrariness and administrative state dominance. Like, I think the concerns that Tom Gray brought up earlier just get worse and worse in that world where Congress
So,
is
so to just
resigned
to
to
follow up,
futility.
so from my point of view, your main idea then is that Congress, we should champion what we can of a revival of Congress as a counterweight antidote to executive overreach.
I think it's not just executive overreach. It's that when we try to do all the policy making through the executive branch, it necessarily suffers from a deep legitimacy problem. Because people have a sense that the executive bashes ahead and does what it wants in the end. It's not good at bringing in this multiplicity of views that are truly representative of the diversity of the country. And so we need to do the work of building these broader coalitions if we want to have stable and legitimate government. And yes, some of that stable and legitimate government will just include bad policies. I'm prepared to say that's okay. Political stability and social peace is worth it. That's what I think. I think the libertarian critique really underrates the achievement of social peace. I think if Brian Kaplan were running things, we would end up in a civil war very quickly.
I think that's kind of a very sort of conservative or conservatarian point of view. I think a libertarian ought to appreciate that social peace is worth something. In fact, it's about the only thing I can say for democracy in the end. Any chance you want to come back to the first thing that I threw up there, this idea of a commission on the deficit? How does that play into your book and your thinking?
So we have, on these big spending questions, I mean, Congress really is the only one with the constitutional authority to provide an answer in the end. And we need something. We need some kind of course correction at some point. So we have to figure out how we can get there. I mean, the main way that American politics has figured out to deal with things is that we wait until the last possible moment when there's going to be a disastrous crisis of epic political proportions, and then everyone can hold hands and jump together and figure something out. And that's by far the most likely thing to happen on Social Security or any of these other things, is that we will wait until the last possible moment, and that's not a healthy dynamic. That's not a good way to do things. So to the extent that we could use any kind of device to kickstart a more forward-looking negotiation that would allow us to work some things out before the last possible minute, I think that would be healthy. I thought the Simpson-Bowles Commission back in 2010 was a pretty worthwhile effort. And it was a shame that it came to nothing. And if somebody managed to generate enough buy-in to create a process like that again, I would be rooting for it. I think at the end of the day, it's still a congressional, it still has to be sort of played out in Congress, whether they're doing the right thing or not. But because making these long-term choices is a naturally hard thing for politicians, period, not just Congress, but for any politician, if a commission could provide a useful jumping off point, I would think that would be just fine.
All right, so Tom, let's give you the last question. You have to unmute. Tom, you have to unmute.
Sorry, I wanted to also thank Philip for coming. I'm living here in Slovakia, maybe you didn't know that, and we have a proportional representation system, and we're now going through an early election. And so you didn't mention proportional representation like most libertarians. When I lived in America as a libertarian, I was in favor of proportional representation. I'm not in favor of it anymore. I think that it's problematic. But I want to talk about earmarks a little bit, which is that my experience with dissidents here in Slovakia is they're very principled, and they are not very good at making deals. And we have corrupt politicians who are quite good at making deals and getting things built, and almost always with corruption. And you know, John is absolutely right that I'm looking down because that's where you are on my screen. The the bills are going to have waste, but you know, if it's 200 million bucks to build a stadium for 100 million, it's 100 million wasted. But if there's 4 years of talk about it and there's a lot of vetocracy, so it doesn't get built, it doesn't get built, as compared to the corrupt government that builds it for 200 million. 100 million was corruptedly wasted, but then you have this thing that's 100 million. And it seems like, to me, a lot of the nice things that get built are built with this corrupt earmark type stuff. So I'm in
Yeah.
favor of earmarks.
I think quid pro quo corruption or honest graft is probably pretty underrated in America today, and we probably undersupply it. You know, we have there's sort of a lot of justified worries about systemic corruption or the whole swamp, but you don't need the old-fashioned kind of quid pro quo corruption so much for that. It works in more insidious ways, I would say. So I would say we should worry less about all that and allow more side deals to make things go forward. I'm enthusiastic for that. A useful part of state capacity sometimes corruption is. On proportional representation, I'm glad to hear your. I would be really curious to hear more from you about what you've observed in Slovakia. I think there are more and more people getting excited about it as a reform proposal in America. I think it makes a little bit of sense to the extent that you think geography has gone obsolete, right? That you think Massachusetts no longer does have distinctive interests. I tend to not believe that. I tend to think geography really still matters a lot, even as we've become a more interconnected world. And so I would like to see sort of the constituent representative relationship that's centered around geographical communities get jump-started rather than going this other way with proportional representation. But you know, it does have some appeal as like something very different to try. When I look at PR systems around the world, yeah, they seem to have a fair amount of chaos built into them. But it'll be interesting to see whether that gathers momentum stateside.
All right, well, thanks a lot, Phil. I'm going to stop the recording.